People often think that you go to the pristine wilderness to photograph large birds and mammals. In reality, you go someplace that you can get quite close to them. Right now we're at Mrazek Pond in the Everglades National Park, and this is a famous pond for bird photographers. We are literally about 20 yards off the paved highway. There's actually a parking lot where we've left our car to come down here and photograph. The reason you come here is that the birds are used to people. If you go to the wild areas, you can't get close to subject matter. Here, with the passing cars, the activity, the commotion, the birds have become habituated somewhat, and they will tolerate close approach. I'm using my 500 millimeter, but I cannot even photograph some of these birds. They're below my minimal focus distance of this particular lens, which is 13 feet. That's why you come to these locations. You want someplace you can get close to the subject matter and you can photograph. Actually, the cover on one of my books is photographed at this pond. I was sitting here on this particular bank one day, many years ago, eating lunch, having a sandwich and a Coke, and I photographed a snowy egret, which is the cover of my book. Earlier we had talked about knowing your subject matter, and this pond is a good example of that. There are a great variety of birds here. We need to pick up some of my field marks so that we can identify different species. We've got great egrets, snowy egrets, a couple of white pelicans out here. We've got a snowy that just landed out in front of me about 20 yards, actually a pretty nice situation. Great egrets have yellow bills, black legs. They're larger than the snowy egrets. Snowies have black bills, black legs, and of course the identifying field mark are the golden slippers, the yellow feet of the snowy egrets. We've also got on this pond a couple of white pelicans. There's actually an alligator cruising back and forth in front of us. Some great blue herons are around. There's 3 or 4 of them. It's amazing. This little pond, which is only an acre or 2 in size, has probably right now a couple hundred birds on it. The reason they're here is that the pond is slowly drying down, and while it contains a food source, minnows primarily, food source is concentrated and the birds can come in and feed. Later in the year the pond will be fished out, it'll dry down too far, and we won't have any birds at all. I've driven by Mrazek Pond when it has been literally covered with birds, and I've also driven by it when there isn't a bird in sight. And the distinguishing factor is whether or not there's a food source for the birds. We've got such a variety here right now that you need to know your field marks of all these birds. We've got some white ibis, we've got some immature ibis. We've got a really good variety. There's actually a kingfisher back in the back of the pond. We've got a greenbacked heron I can see from right here. It's really a great pond for a variety of subject matter. I'm going to back off and see if I can get the snowy egret that's in front of me. He's a pretty nice shot. Actually, there are 2 white pelicans that are wandering into my background from where I shoot, and I'm going to have to move over some. The other problem is I have some definite specular highlights behind the bird. So if I move over a little bit, perhaps I can put the bird against an isolated dark background. Let's see what happens. I'm looking at a backlit great egret out here. It's on a small little branch right on the water, and it's really beautiful because it's isolated against the dark water. I've got a halo of light all the way around the bird. I carefully pick my shooting location so that all I get is dark water behind it. Really isolated, really posterized. What I'm doing is I'm spot metering the bird. One of the reasons I like the f4 Nikon, I can spot meter the bird just right on the bird's plumage, which is white. Open up to make the shadowed side light. Recompose, and I'm doing this on manual exposure. Recompose, and he just raised his head out of my frame as soon as he drops his head and neck down. Oh, here we go, here we go. Now he's going to drop his head down, and as soon as he does that, nice, very, very nice. I'm getting highlights off the ripples in the water, and nice halo right around this bird. Very, very nice. His bill is just translucent. He's got his head cocked just a little bit. It's going to come flat to the camera again. There it is. Very, very nice. That's a nice shot. In fact, I'm going to do a vertical. I'll turn my head around so I can see through the camera. Oh, I'm picking up a little bit of the far shore. I've got one highlight up there I don't like. Recompose a tad down. I need to bring the tripod up so I get rid of that highlight on the shore. Shoot down at a little angle. I don't want to get too high though. That's better. Now I can eliminate shoreline, just have isolated bird. Very, very nice. I'm shooting a lot of pictures all at once, multiple originals, for a number of reasons. Number one, I want a lot of frames in my file. If I have one good shot, only one client can look at it at a time. If I have several dozen shots, hopefully several dozen clients can all look at it. I can make a little better income. The other thing I think is there's always a slight variation. Yeah, he just raised his neck and his wings. Got a shot of that. There's always a little bit of difference. Plus, what if you get a scratch on that one and only frame you have? I'd like to have some for the agencies. I'd like to have a few frames in my file. I'd like to be able to put one in a slideshow. So I want multiple originals. You can never make a dupe as good as an original. So the way to make a perfect dupe is shoot more originals. I like the way actually this bird's bouncing around because he's going to spread his wings. I want to swing around and try and shoot a horizontal here. If he spreads his wings, I can't fit in. Whoop, there he goes. Well, that's why you keep shooting while you have a chance. Nice egret. Very, very pretty. Now what we'll do is just hang around and wait. Another one's bound to come in sooner or later. We certainly got the birds here to spend some time, see which one comes in where. For flying birds, I'm using a shoulder stock here. This is a homemade shoulder stock. Take it off the camera for a second and show it to you. This is nothing fancy. It's actually just some 1/4-inch thick aluminum, actually several pieces I've pieced together down in my workshop because I happen to have these little scraps, a little bit 1/8-inch thick aluminum through here. Nothing special at all. The reason I'm using this is that flying birds are hard to follow if you're working off a tripod, if they're in reasonably tight. From a tripod, you've got to run around the tripod head to follow the moving bird. This shoulder stock gives me some mobility, gives me a little bit of ease in using it, especially here where we've got a number of birds that are going to be moving around. I made this very easily. I actually held up this lens, which is a 300 millimeter. I think for flying birds that's an ideal focal length. It's light, easy to use. And I just held it up to my eye, and I used a yardstick to figure out how long I wanted to make this. There's nothing fancy about this. It's just a brace. I don't think you really need all these cables and things like that to get to the motor drive. After all, I've got a hand that can hit the motor drive. The other hand can focus. It's very, very easy to use. If you can, what I would suggest is wind yourself up first. And then as you follow focus, the direction the bird's going, you're taking the tension off your body. And it's much simpler, it's much easier, and a lot sturdier. If we've got a bird going from my left to my right, I'll just wind up as I focus, follow focus with my lens, and press the shutter button. That's it. This great egret was photographed in Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge near Fort Myers, Florida. Ding Darling is one of the best of the refuges for photography. Obviously a long lens was used, in this case a 500 millimeter. Morning and evening are the best time to photograph at Ding Darling. Look at this roseate spoonbill, photographed just at sunset. Most people go out into the refuge in the middle of the day, absolutely the wrong time to photograph. There's such a great variety of birds there that if you work very early and very late, you can certainly get good photographs. You just need a really long lens, something like a 400 or 500 millimeter. 500 is my choice for birds. These parakeet auklets were photographed in the Pribilof Islands of Alaska, north of the Aleutian chain. This is about as remote as you can possibly get. It's certainly a far away from Florida. The Pribilofs are good to work because the birds are unwary, that is, they're not used to people. The biggest problem here is that you're working on the edge of a cliff and it's about 150 feet straight down to the Arctic Ocean. You certainly don't have to be as remote as the Pribilos. Here's a cardinal photographed in my backyard at a wintertime feeding station. I've simply set up a blind next to my feeder and waited for birds to come in. You might notice the lighting, it's all overcast. The way my backyard's situated, if it's a sunny day, I get mottled sun across where the birds are, and it doesn't look very good, so I simply wait for an overcast day. This killdeer on eggs is also photographed from a blind. In this case, I'm using a 400mm lens. I would urge you, though, not to work birds on the nest. There's enough stress on birds right now without any photographer adding any more stress. A good blind to use, though, is your car. Here's an upland sandpiper shot right out of my car window. It's easy to use a car as a blind. Simply find a road with some old fence along the side and ease into location. You need to turn the motor off, obviously, and you need a support to use out of your window. There are commercially made window brackets, or what I like even better, just a bean bag. When you see photographs like this great horned owl headshot, it's probably not a wild bird. This photograph was actually made in a wildlife rehabilitation center. The bird had been injured, but I could still come in and do tight portraits like this. This red-shouldered hawk is an example of a lucky shot. This is photographed at a marina. I had actually stopped to find a shade tree where I could eat my lunch, and in the tree was this immature red-shouldered hawk taking anoles, small lizards, off the bark of the tree. This is photographed with an 80 to 200mm lens and fill flash. Like I said, sometimes you just get lucky. I'm just entering some information into my database. We'll be talking a lot in tape 5 about using computers, how to keep track of slides, entering all the information that you need to have in order to run a photographic business or just to keep track of your photographic files. A lot of people ask me about how you get knowledge about a subject. Where do you find out the information to enter in this database? What is this subject that you've been photographing? Where do you find it? Well, there are a lot of answers to that question. There's no substitute, of course, for direct outside observation. The best thing you can possibly do is go out and look at your subject. Of course, you can't always do that, so there are a lot of other places you can turn to get information. There are groups, the Sierra Club, the National Audubon Society. You can get a lot of information from them. There are courses available at your local community college or your nature center. There are all sorts of seminars available, things like that. There are TV programs that you can watch and get information from. Of course, then there are books. All sorts of books, field guides, books about general information. Some of these are better than others, but there are a wide variety of books that you can turn to get information. I've got a few here on my desk. Some of these I really enjoy. This is the Geographic Bird Guide, which is one of the best of the bird guides that are available right now, a field guide. I really like this best of any other bird guide that I've seen. There are field guides to all sorts of subjects. Here's a field guide to the Pacific States wildflowers. A very excellent field guide. This is that one was part of the Peterson series of field guide. Another standard field guide series is put out by the Golden Press. I particularly like their tree field guide. It's to all of North America. Field guides can be very small and inexpensive also. For years, the Golden Nature Guide series has been available. These are quite inexpensive. This, I think, is one of the best popular books on spiders. You can tell I've had this one for a while. It's starting to fall apart. I've used it so much. There really aren't many books on spiders, yet little books like this, $1.50, $1.25, give you a lot of information. There are some very specialized field guides. Here's one, a field guide to the national parks of East Africa. An excellent book if you're planning a Kenyan safari. Books like this are not readily available in the average bookstore. You might have to ask your bookseller to look up in books in print publication about specific field guides for specific locations, or contact some of the large tour companies. Maybe the tour company that you're planning to go with will have books like this available. There are other books that you can look at. For example, here's another Africa book, a book called Safari. Doing a little research at your local library, you'll come up with books like this. It'll give you pictures and text, certain ideas of things that you might see, times of year. You'll get some background information from a book like that. Here's a picture book on Oregon. I collect books like this. In fact, whenever I travel, one of the first things I do in a new region is go into the local bookstore and try and see all the books about that area. I'll look at postcard racks also, calendars. You might as well take advantage of somebody else's legwork in a specific area to see what's around, see what scenes are there, what's a good-looking area, what time of the day was it shot. So picture books are a good subject resource. Of course, there are all sorts of other books. There are subject matter books. Here's Polar Bears by Ian Sterling. It gives you a lot of information about the subject matter. There are books on specific types of subjects. Animal Navigation by Talbot Waterman talks about, specifically, as the title suggests, animal navigation. And that opens up all sorts of possibilities for photographic essays. There are other books which you can certainly look at. Some books are more background information. Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez, one of my personal favorite books. I think it's very interesting to read general background so you have an understanding of a certain area. Some other books that I often collect when I'm traveling are books on hiking and backpacking, because even though they're not written for the photographer, they'll tell you about really good areas to get into and give you some idea of what to expect. This one is on the Escalante area of southern Utah, which is a beautiful area to photograph and indeed a very good backpacking area. I found this book at a Bureau of Land Management office, actually in the little town of Escalante, Utah. And if you really specialize, if you want an odd book, if you want something right to the point for wildlife photography, here's one I'd highly recommend. I'm sitting here in the best shade I can find. It's high noon in the Everglades. It's really hot today. Middle of the day is not a very good time to photograph most things, but small animate creatures can be chased with a flash rig like I've got. Particularly butterflies, lizards, things like that. They're very active in the heat of the day. At least right here they are. I use the same outfit basically for all the small animate creatures. Butterflies, even frogs at night. Lizards, skinks, anything like that. If it's moving around rapidly, some sort of flash outfit like I've got here works really good. Most small things are between about 3/4 life size and 1/4 life size. That is, from about a subject size 4 by 6 inches on down. And any sort of lens combination that'll give you this sort of coverage works well. I've got some extension tubes and a 105mm macro lens and a homemade bracket. Through the lens flash, most camera systems today support TTL flash, and you might as well make use of the convenience of TTL flash. Well, I've been taking a break sitting here in the shade. I've been chasing butterflies for about an hour or so. I've cooled off a little bit anyway. Why don't we pick up and go chase a few more? Let's see what we can do. There's been a number that have been hanging around real close on this Bidens, this stick tight. There's a few nice ones down here. Got a zebra right in front of me. Very, very jumpy. Very hard to get. The nice thing is we've got enough stuff that's coming in and out that I can chase something for a while and then I'll chase something else for a while. And between all this stuff I'm bound to get a few good frames off. With the wind, it's very, very difficult to make sure you're getting sharp photographs. You're going to have to shoot a lot of film to get a few good frames. The other thing that you want to make sure of is when you're working butterflies, it's not so bad here because it's reasonably in the open, but a lot of time people will make sure that they can see the butterfly, nothing in front of the lens, but they'll forget their flash has to be out in the open also. I've seen people chase butterflies and there'll be a big green leaf right in front of their flash. They're going to get pretty green pictures when they do that. So you want to make sure that both the lens and the flash are not impeded by any of the vegetation. Let's see what we can find. Well, there's the skipper again. What I'm using here is a 105mm macro lens plus extension. Now you certainly don't need to have a macro lens, but macro has built-in extension in it. In other words, I can focus very close with this combination. I need anything that will get me down to about life size on the film. That is, an inch by an inch and a half subject area is life size. We'll be talking more about this on our close-up tape. But if I can get between, half life, 2 by 3 inches subject area, and life, 1 by 1.5 inches, I can cover this butterfly very well. So any lens combination that gives me this coverage will work. However, by going to 105mm rather than, let's say, a 50, I've got some working distance. I can stay back. This guy is being very cooperative, and it's reasonably easy to get within a foot of him. But if I were trying to get within 6 inches or 4 inches, something like that, I'd be in a lot more trouble. A lot of insects simply won't take that sort of close approach. This is about as cooperative as you're going to get. It's nice to have the built-in motor because this way the film is always wound. I'm just leaving my flash on. You may notice I'm focusing by leaning in and out, keeping the film plane parallel to the plane of his wings. This is actually a fairly unusual specimen because my shadow, I can take the shadow of my hand and it's not flushing him. A lot of butterflies, if your shadow goes across them, they will flush. They'll fly away from that shadow. If you do have to shadow an insect, a lot of times it's best to ease in real gradually so that your shadow is just like a passing cloud. For some reason this guy doesn't seem to care. Perhaps it's where we're working. There's a lot of from the trees surrounding this area, there's a lot of shadows blowing in and out with the wind. He's so high that in this wind it's very, very awkward for me to try and hit focus. I'm hoping that he'll land a little bit lower. Lower vegetation won't pendulate quite as much as this guy is. He's just back and forth, but he looks gorgeous. There's another one further down here. Maybe I'll go down and see what I can do on it. We've actually got a couple different butterflies here. The problem now is getting in parallel to this one. I'm going to come in reasonably slow, kneel down here. Now, there he flushes. Let's see what we can do. This is not as nice a specimen as the other one is. Still, he's blowing so hard in the wind. He can't get a shot though. That looked good. Oh yeah, that looked good. One thing I like about this flash combination is that there's a ready light in the finder, so I know when the flash is recharged. That's very handy. If he turns a little bit more, whoa, he jumped over to the other flower. Now he left totally. Well, they're hanging around this Bidden's patch, this stick-tight patch. And one thing we'll do, the sulfur just went through, I'll just hang around this patch. If you spend a couple hours on a patch of flowers like this, especially stick-tights, you usually can get some results. It's very frustrating though. A couple things I suggest is follow the same individual insect. If you follow the same specimen continually, it seems like they will start to accept you and be a lot less jumpy. So they may fly away 10 yards or so, 15 yards, just get up and follow the same one. The biggest problem I see people doing is they don't keep the film plane in the camera parallel to the plane of the wings. You have such limited depth of field, you absolutely have to be parallel to them, which means if there's a butterfly on the ground, the camera should be on the ground. I've got my little guy back in front of me here again. He's kind of a ratty flower. Another thing we want to do is make sure it's a good-looking situation. There's no sense shooting pictures on bad-looking, beat-up flowers unless we pick a good flower. He's jumping around enough that just by waiting, we'll find another one. We had a long-tailed skipper come in. He's right in front of me. Woo, there he goes, blasting away. Long-tailed skippers are a real diagnostic of the southeast. Here's a ruddy daggerwing butterfly. This was photographed in extreme South Florida. This is a true tropical butterfly that only comes into the United States in this one area. And you can see what flash lets me do. This red-eyed tree frog also is shot with flash. It illustrates the variety of subjects that you can use with a handheld flash rig. This is photographed with one flash and a 105mm lens plus extension to get to this image size, which is about a half life size. This jumping spider is really neat. Jumping spiders are easily identified by the 8 headlight eyes which they have, this one pair right in front, larger than all the others. Nice thing about jumping spiders is they don't form a web as orb web weavers do. Instead, they hunt their prey down. Consequently, you'll often find them on flat, solid backgrounds, easy to light up with a single flash. You certainly don't always need a flash, though. Look at this European skipper on one grass head. This was photographed early in the morning with natural light. A 105mm lens, the same one I've shot these other pictures with, this time mounted on a tripod and carefully positioned and worked into place. You certainly can use a longer lens. This Townsend chipmunk, photographed in Washington State, was shot with a 300mm lens plus an extension tube in order to make it focus close enough. Of course I used a tripod. The secret here was I went to some place I could get close to the chipmunk, in this case a picnic area in a national park. To photograph this prairie rattlesnake, I also used a longer than normal lens. In this case, a 200mm plus an extension tube. You want to be very careful doing poisonous animals. Here's a place you might want a helper, somebody to watch out and make sure that nothing goes awry, just in case. But if you want to photograph things like this gray hair-streaked butterfly, you really don't need anyone else. Once again, this one is shot with a 105mm lens and a single flash unit. You'll notice how I carefully positioned the camera parallel to the butterfly. Photographing this grasshopper, the position of the camera was all important. Notice where this is shot from. My camera is lying right on the ground, and the flash delineates every detail of this grasshopper laying eggs. Probably the best accessory you can buy if you want to improve the quality of your photographs is a good, sturdy tripod. And I've got several tripods here which I would recommend. What are the features you want in any tripod? Number one, you want sturdiness. You want a tripod to hold whatever lens you're going to put on it. Some other things I think you ought to look for, though, are one, it ought to go to your eye level without the center post. After all, the minute you use a lot of center post extension, you no longer have a tripod, you have a monopod with a three-legged base on it. It also ought to go low to the ground. You'd like to be able to work right side up with the camera just like normal, but low to the ground. All the tripods I'm going to show you here permit this feature. You may have seen ads where they talk about inverting a center post to get low-level operation.
Believe me, this does not work in the field. Inverting a center post means that the camera is upside down also, and you have to crawl in underneath the legs trying to work around any obstacles. That's not a good way to work. You want the camera to be right side up, but the tripod just low to the ground. So what tripods do I recommend? One of the best buys on the market right now is this particular tripod, which is the Bogan model 3021. Now that number, 3021, refers to the legs, not to the head. And I'll come back and talk about heads in just a few minutes. This is a very good tripod for the money. It's affordable. It's available pretty widely. A lot of people have said that these leg locks are very easy to use, and it's reasonably sturdy. In fact, I use this tripod as my backpacking tripod. However, it has a couple drawbacks. I wouldn't put a big lens like this on this particular tripod. It's not quite that sturdy. Focal length range, I might use up to maybe 300 millimeter or perhaps a 400 millimeter on this tripod, but that's starting to push it. The biggest drawback I see with this tripod is it's not quite tall enough for a lot of people. I'm 5'11", and you can see this tripod is all the way up, and here for horizontal, I'm already having to bend over a little bit. If I shoot a vertical, I really have to stoop down to be able to use the tripod. You could solve this by pulling the center post all the way up, but if you do that, you're creating another problem. You're losing sturdiness whenever you extend the center post, and sure enough, you'll get a little flexing in the tripod by doing this. I'd keep it as low as I possibly could. You may have to use some, but try to avoid it if you can. Here's the heaviest tripod which I own. This is the Gitzo 410R. Gitzo, G-I-T-Z-O, is a French tripod maker. They make a whole variety of tripods. They're rather expensive, but they're guaranteed for life. Imagine if Ford and Chrysler and GM had this attitude. You break it, we fix it. This is a very good, sturdy tripod. It's actually very tall. It'll go considerably above my head. I don't have the legs out all the way right now. It'll also go absolutely flat to the ground. It has no center post, so you can spread the legs out perfectly flat and shoot quite low to the ground. I particularly like this tripod when using big heavy lenses like this 500 millimeter f4. It's very sturdy. It'll hold almost anything. The only drawback is its weight. It's hard to carry around, and it gets awfully heavy on your shoulders. I've added this pipe insulation to make things a little softer. This is just standard pipe insulation available at almost any hardware store. I took the tripod down to the hardware, determined the right diameter insulation, and bought a piece for about $1.50. Cut it to length and taped it on. It's a little easier on your hands, and if you carry the tripod over your shoulder, it's a little softer on your shoulder. All in all, this is a very good tripod. Over here is actually my day-in, day-out tripod. This is my favorite tripod of all. It's a Gitzo model 320, which I've set up to show how low to the ground it'll go. It'll actually go up right to my eye level with no problem at all. Some of the older versions of this came with a long center post, which prohibited this low-level provision. Gitzo does offer a 5-inch long center post column, or you can just take the long center post and use a hacksaw and cut it off. That's what I did. It's very easy to do. You may notice that I've put tape on this tripod legs. That's not to disguise the tripod and make it black or anything like that. It's simply because this is a metal tripod, and in cold weather, your hands will get very cold handling the tripod, handling the metal. I've taken plain electrician's tape, black tape, and taped the tripods just to keep my hands a little bit warmer. Even wearing gloves, I notice a difference. You could take bicycle handlebar tape and do this. I think that would be the perfect thing to use. Basically, there are two kinds of tripod heads available, ball and socket heads and three-way pan tilt heads. Which kind you use is a very personal decision. There's no one tripod head that's perfect for all people. I'd urge you to take your camera gear down to the camera store, mount different lenses on different tripod heads, and see which ones you like. For close-ups and for scenics, I prefer a three-way pan tilt head. This particular head is a Bogan model 3047. It's an older head. There's a new version of this exact same head out, and the differences are basically cosmetic. This head allows controlling movement in each axis with a different lock, so that I can rotate, tilt forwards, and flip for a vertical all with separate controls. As I said, I really like this head for scenes and for close-ups, and the reason that I like it is exactly those three controls. I can move one direction without moving anything else. If I want to slightly rotate but nothing else, I can do it very carefully. One thing I've noticed is a lot of people mount their cameras 90 degrees the wrong direction on a three-way pan-tilt head. Almost every pan-tilt head I've seen, when you flip for a vertical, the camera goes to the left. Now you can still tilt. If you find that you cannot tilt when the camera's in a vertical orientation, something's wrong. You'll know something's really wrong if you're loosening the tripod screw, reorienting the camera, and then retightening it. You've mounted the camera 90 degrees the wrong direction. Here's a small ball and socket head. It's very compact, but its actual size is a drawback. You can't put too big of a lens on this particular ball and socket head. The reason I don't like ball and socket heads for close-ups and for scenes is that when you loosen the lock, it moves all directions at once. It's very difficult to move one axis without moving the other axis also simultaneously. This head would be good for smaller cameras with short lenses, but for precision work, I personally don't like it that well. However, for action work, I do like a ball and socket head. This is a big ball and socket head. This particular one is an Arca Swiss, and it's made for action photography. This tripod head also has a quick release system built into the head. This silver plate is fastened to the bottom of the lens. Then it has a dovetail on it, and the plate drops into a dovetail clamp on the top of the head using this knob on the side. It's a very sturdy, solid system. There's a knob for the quick release and a large knob on the other side of the head which releases the head itself. One bit of advice is to always keep the knobs on opposite sides. If you put them on the same side, one day you'll reach for the tripod head control, and instead you'll loosen the quick release and your lens will fall on the ground. One nice thing about this particular ball head is it has a tension adjustment on the ball. That is, you can set the drag, how much stiffness there is on the ball. So if you're working action and you want to follow an animal or a bird, you can actually let go of the lens a little bit and it doesn't just fall over. Most ball heads don't have a tension control. The minute you let loose of them, they flop down unless they're locked solid. However, this is a very large, very expensive, also very sturdy ball head. The wider the ball, the sturdier any ball head would be. I would not particularly buy this ball head unless you're going to go out and shoot long, fast lenses like this 500mm f4. As I said, this tripod head is very expensive. If you want to try out a ball and socket head for a lot less money, I'd consider buying something like the Bogan Model 3055. It's a good ball and socket head. It even has its own built-in quick release system. It has most of the features of this head. It's a lot less money. However, it's not in the same class as this Arca Swiss. Remember earlier I talked about tripod collars? Here's a lens with such a collar mounted on this tripod. By loosening the collar, I can rotate the lens and camera for verticals or horizontals without flipping the tripod head around. This is really handy. By keeping the mass of the lens and the camera right above the tripod, I get a more stable setup. Plus, I don't have to move everything when I'm rotating vertical horizontal. I keep the same basic orientation. If I'm shooting close-ups, I don't have to recompose so much. If I'm working from a blind, where you're shooting through a little hole, I don't have to move the tripod or worry about repositioning the whole setup. I can change back and forth just by loosening this collar. It's a great way to work. If you have a lens with such a collar, make sure you use it. I've seen a lot of people using lenses with collars where they still flip the tripod head over to the side. This is creating an unstable situation, and you'll get far more vibration, consequently less sharp photographs. Something else to consider to make sure you're getting sharp photographs is to use a cable release. I've got one here in my pocket. This is a mechanical one. It's about 1 foot long, which is all you need. Today you can either use mechanical cable releases or electronical ones. They still work the same way. They fit into a socket. If you're getting a mechanical cable release, get a good one. Don't buy these cheap ones that are readily available. The best ones I know on the market are like this, which is a Nikon cable release. It's reasonably inexpensive, but it'll last a lifetime. The way you use a cable release, doesn't matter if it's mechanical or electronical, is just gently hold it. Don't pull tight because you'll be adding vibration to the system. Just gently loop it, trigger it. By the way, a cable release is not used for action photography. After all, if you have to follow focus or move the tripod head around and focus, you run out of hands. Shooting action, take the cable release off and just hold on to the camera. But for static subjects, for scenes, for close-ups, things like that, a cable release is a great help. We're here in Yellowstone National Park. It's a very mild winter right now, and there are a lot of pronghorn antelope out in this field. I'm going to go try stalking them, see what we can do, see if we can get in close on them. A few hints on stalking. Number one, have your equipment ready to go right away when you're working mammals this way. You want your tripod set up at whatever height you're going to be shooting at, get a meter reading ahead of time, be all set to photograph. So let's ease in and see what we can do. One thing you want to make sure, of course, is pick a good looking animal that you're going to photograph. And you want to go places at prime time. Make sure the animals are in good shape at the best time of year. You don't want to pick a ratty animal to photograph. So let's see what we can do here. We've got a lot of mammals out here, a lot of antelope. Best thing to do is just ease in slowly, take our time, pretend like we're just casually strolling through this field. There are a lot of antelope in here. Let's cut on up that way a bit. Let's see what we can do. A lot of the elk in Yellowstone are really pretty docile. And some nice bucks that you can get in tight on. Bison you got to be real careful about. Bison are probably the most dangerous of all the North American big game. People always think of bears. In reality, there are more bison gorings, bison problems than anything else in the United States. People think they're big, dumb, slow animals. In reality, they're exceedingly fast over a short distance. And there are no trees to hide behind where bison are. Got two males out here. It's kind of nice, two of them together walking. Yeah, they're sort of scattering. Can't get a composition out of it. Let's see what we can do. I'll keep cutting over. They're fairly accepting. Of course, they know just how far they need to be out of the range of this lens, and they're staying at that exact distance. I think these guys have been photographed before. For all subjects, there's a perfect time, and I think that's the biggest thing you need to realize, is that mammals look good at a certain time of year, basically autumn, late autumn for most mammals. Birds you want to photograph in the spring when they're in breeding plumage. Mammals you want to get when they've got their winter coats on. These guys are going to trot around us here. I want to get ready. And this one little male is staring like crazy at me. So pretty. Pronghorns are really nice. Nice big black eyes. Just gorgeous. Pronghorns are an odd animal in that late in the season the males shed their horn sheath, the outer part of the top of the horns. And, basically, they're the only animal on Earth that does that. They end up with these little stubby horns until next spring. Most of the antlered animals, true antlered animals, lose their antlers in the fall or at the end of the season. Horned animals keep their horns year-round. Pronghorns are sort of in between in the middle. The males drop the prong sheaths. They're real strange. They're not a true antelope either. They're an oddball species. North America does not have a true antelope species. These are nice. They're getting in kind of a nice position out here. That nice scene here. A little snow on the far hillside. A male and 3 females grazing. I've been shooting a lot of horizontals here, mainly just because that's the way the subject happened to be falling. It's nice to show the expanse. Horizontals show expanse a lot better than verticals do. Verticals tend to be a little more tense. However, I'd urge you to try to shoot both. It's certainly nice to recompose and see if you can get a vertical out of it. Here, because of the physical situation that I'm working in, verticals don't work very well. In the background, I start picking up a snowy range in the background, and it just doesn't look good as a backdrop across the top of the frame. Ideally, you'll shoot both. You'll shoot both horizontals and verticals. But it is dependent upon how you can compose the scene. Obviously, if you're going to shoot magazine covers, they're going to probably want verticals with room for a logo at the top. But ideally, shoot both. They're two different feelings. Shooting birds and mammals in that sense is the same as shooting any sort of subject. You have to compose. You're not just taking a record shot of an animal. You're making a composition with an animal in the frame. One thing I don't really like to do that much of anymore is the tight portrait. It's been done. I'd rather shoot a scene with an animal in it. You also have to watch out, unfortunately, places like this, watch out for things like beer cans, bottles, odds and ends of trash out on the prairie. Sometimes you get your film back and you discover that all sorts of odd things have suddenly appeared that you never saw before. I'm actually out here with a whole group of people on a tour of Yellowstone National Park. We've been photographing scenes and mammals and all sorts of things. One of the real hints, I'd say, for shooting mammals is go someplace where they're relatively tame. People think that photographers go out into the absolute wilderness to photograph mammals, big game, but in reality you go someplace where you can get close to them. And that's basically the national park, someplace where there have been a lot of people around the mammals. Here we're only a couple hundred yards off the road. We just parked and walked out here into this field. The pronghorn have seen a lot of people before. They're not that skittish. Places where they've been hunted, they're a lot jumpier than they are here. Here they're used to people, they're used to some commotion, cars, things like that. We can get reasonably close. The vast majority of my bird and mammal work I do someplace where I can literally get out of the car and walk a very short distance and photograph. I'm shooting a 500mm lens right now. For something like these pronghorn, you need really long lenses. Actually, I don't have the tripod head I'd normally use. I've got a 3-way pan tilt head, which is not the head of choice. I'd be using a ball head normally. But I'm here shooting more scenics than I am mammals, so this head certainly works. But you need long lenses. Primarily for mammals, I'd shoot 300, 400, 500, something like that. 300 for maybe large mammals with a scene. 400 would be my lens of choice for just big game. 500 is about as long as I would go. I personally don't own anything longer than 500. This is a 500 f4 I've got on the tripod right now. Add a 1.4 teleconverter, gives me a 700 5.6 if I need it. That's an awfully long lens. Of course, out here in the open prairie like we are, you need focal length, especially for these pronghorns, which don't let you get too close at all. You might notice I'm not really carrying a camera bag either. here, you know you're going out working these pronghorn. There's no sense carrying everything with you. I don't need a 24mm lens like this, particularly when I'm close to the car here. I'm coming out to shoot mammals and not much else right now. I've got some extra film tucked away in my pockets. If I thought I needed it, I would have probably brought an 80 to 200 zoom, something like that with me also, but there's no sense carrying everything. You also notice I'm not wearing camouflage. A lot of people think you have to wear camo, you have to sneak up on the mammals. Pronghorn know you're there. They exist by knowing that predators are out here. In fact, I don't ever wear camouflage. I shouldn't say that. I wear camouflage sometimes when I want to hide from other people and go unnoticed, but I am not worried about hiding from the animals at all. After all, they exist by knowing that predators are in the woods or in the meadows. When you're out with a tripod and you're clanking around with lenses and tripod legs, things like that, they know you're there. You're much better off, instead of wearing camo, just strolling slowly and taking your time. That's a better way to do it. This bighorn sheep was photographed in Wyoming. I was using a 300mm lens, which is about the shortest focal length you can use for wildlife photography. But bighorn in the right location are fairly approachable. A caribou on the Alaska tundra is also fairly approachable. Again, this is a 300mm shot. But a caribou is really quite a large mammal. In contrast, a cottontail, as in this photograph, is a very small mammal. This photograph is made with a 400mm lens. Actually, rabbits and hares are far more difficult to photograph than either caribou or bighorn sheep, because rabbits tend to run away, not walk away. They're really skittish. This mule deer was also shot with a 400mm lens. Even in this photograph, a portrait, you can see how action should be going into the photograph, into the frame. The deer is looking across its back into the frame rather than looking out of the photograph. This hoary marmot photograph is an example of how you need to be a good naturalist. Being a better naturalist will make you become a better nature photographer. This marmot is gathering vegetation to line its winter burrow with, not to eat. You need to know natural history. These brown bear cubs were photographed at a very specific location, Katmai National Park. Katmai and the adjoining McNeil River Bear Sanctuary are two of the best places in the world to photograph brown bears fishing for salmon. These bear cubs were photographed with a 500mm lens plus a 1.4 teleconverter for a simple reason. They were standing all the way across the river and I needed a long lens for reach. Another specific location is East Africa. Here these impala were photographed with a 400mm lens, but not off a tripod. In East Africa you work out of vehicles. A 400mm is my favorite East African lens. I'm shooting off of beanbag. The nice thing about East Africa is that you can drive up to animals. Look at this cheetah. It's used to vehicles and we've driven up fairly close to it. I'm shooting with a straight 400mm lens.
People are always interested in equipment. Let me go through the equipment, some of the equipment that I own. And this is not a recommendation that you go out and buy the exact same equipment I have. This is just going to be a discussion of what I happen to own and what I have found to be useful. Some 35mm equipment is better to use in the field than other 35mm equipment. And I'm pretty prejudiced in that I've looked at a lot of different brands of equipment and a lot of different lenses, and some things work easier, some things work harder. Let me give you my 2 cents worth. I happen to use Nikon equipment. That's not an endorsement of Nikon per se, that's simply a historical fact. I first bought into the Nikon system in the late 60s and now I own a lot of Nikon equipment, so I'm going to keep using it. But I am very, very pleased with Nikon. You certainly don't have to own a Nikon though to go out and take saleable quality photographs. I own several different camera bodies. I own both the F3s and the F4s, and I really like the new F4 cameras. I'm very happy that they've updated the electronics. They've put a spot meter into the F4s. I really enjoy features like that, which are becoming current on all the new cameras, particularly the spot meter device, where you're metering a very, very narrow angle of view. But a couple of things I would look for on any
camera body if I were buying a new body for field photography today. Probably the most important thing in my mind is a depth of field preview lever. Some way of mechanically stopping the lens down so you can see what the film is seeing rather than viewing through the lens wide open. And on Nikons, they simply have a silver little button which you push, which stops the lens down to your pre-selected shooting aperture, and when you let go of it, the lens opens back up again. That's very, very handy. I do like the cameras with built-in motor drives. Most of the currently produced cameras do have either a motor drive or a motor winder built in. That's very nice because you're always ready for the next shot. I also personally like interchangeable viewfinders where you can change the viewfinder screen up in the prism. On an f4 Nikon, it's very easy because you can just take the prism off and the viewfinder screen is right on the top of the camera, so that you can change them very simply and very easily. I like the all matte screens, or better yet for landscape photography, I use the all matte screen with an architectural grid, a sort of tic-tac-toe grid etched into the frame. I really enjoy that because it helps in composition. It also helps keep horizons level. One more thing you might notice, I have two f4 bodies here, and you'll notice that the camera straps are actually different colors. I color code my cameras because I may be shooting different films, and I can keep track of what camera has what film in it this way. So I have a yellow strap and a black strap, and I actually own two f3 cameras, and I've done the exact same thing to them. It's just a good way of keeping track of what you're doing. That way you don't accidentally pick up the wrong camera at the wrong time. If Nikon actually made a silver version, a chrome version, and a black version of the f4, I would buy one of each because that would be an even simpler way of color coding my equipment, of being able to tell at a quick glance which camera I'm picking up, which camera has what film in it. I do still keep my f3s around for a couple of reasons. You'll notice right away that the f3 without a motor is a lot smaller, a lot lighter, just more compact in general. And at times when I want to save on size and weight, bulk, things like that, an f3 without a motor drive on it is really convenient. I do like these cameras, and although they don't have a built-in spot meter, they have all the other features which I like on cameras. They've proved to be very reliable and very rugged. I've had them since they first came out, and they just keep on working. I like the cameras a lot. Let's look at a few lenses now and see what all we come up with. Let's start off with a standard 50mm lens. And in reality, I've never owned a normal 50mm lens. This is a 55mm macro lens, which I have instead of a normal 50. I don't particularly use it for close-ups. The problem is you're so physically close to the subject you have limited working distance. I use this more as an all-round 50mm focal length. After all, a macro lens simply means that close focus is all by itself. It's still a 50 or 55mm focal length. It's the same thing as a regular 55mm lens. It just focuses closer. One nice thing about macro lenses is that they do have very small f-stops on them if you need them. This lens goes down to f32, and while I don't often shoot pictures at f32, at least the f-stop's there if I need it. I've had this lens since 1969, and it's still the only 55mm lens I've ever owned. However, it's a very good lens, and I still shoot pictures with it and still sell pictures with it. So what else do we have? Let's look at some other lenses here. Here's the next shorter focal length which I carry, which is the 35mm lens. This is actually the fastest lens which I own. It's an f2 wide open. I personally like the 35mm format, that the 35mm angle of view. It just fits my vision. That's not to suggest that you should run out and buy a 35mm lens. Everybody has their own way of seeing the world, and for the way I see things, 35mm is a very nice focal length. You might notice right away that I have a lens hood on this lens. As we go through the lenses in my bag here, you'll find out that every lens I own has a lens hood on it. My old 55 macro actually has a built-in lens hood in that the lens elements are recessed way down in it, so I haven't added an additional one. But otherwise, I have a lens hood on every lens I own. I use these religiously for a couple of reasons. They cut down any flare that you're going to get in the lens, And if you're shooting in inclement weather, if you're shooting in the rain or snow, they also keep rain or snow off the front element of the lens. And speaking of the front element, I don't put skylight filters on. You've probably heard a lot of people say you always ought to use a skylight or UV filter to protect your lens, and they've never said what you're protecting the lens from. I've often imagined that there's some maniac out there coming out at night doing vile things to the front of your lenses. I think that you only ought to add a UV or a skylight when you can specifically state what it is you're protecting your lens against. I want to protect this 35mm lens against blowing sand. That's a reason to use a protective filter. Salt spray, there would be another reason to use a filter on the front to protect the element. Otherwise, I suggest you only use a filter when you can absolutely state a reason to do so. I use wide-angle lenses, anything shorter than 50, primarily for landscape photography. Of course, you're not going to go out and shoot wildlife with a 35mm wide-angle lens, but for landscape work, for scenic work, or for the intimate landscape where you're cramming a lens in real close to foreground details, doing sections of landscape up close and personal, I do like the wide angles. This is a 35mm. The widest angle that I actually own is a 24mm lens. This is a 24mm f2.8. I also particularly like a 24mm focal length. I don't own anything wider than 24mm. I've had a 20 in the past and occasionally use a 20mm lens, but a 24 is the widest thing that I normally carry. Again, you might notice that there's even a lens hood, although it's not very thick. There is a lens hood on this 24mm lens. Again, this is a scenic lens, a landscape photography lens. Let's go the other way. We've gone from 50mm down to 24mm, from normal to wide angle. Let's go from normal to the longer focal lengths. The next jump from me, from 50, is up to 105. Basically, most of my focal lengths are in doubles and halves, or pretty close to that. This is a 105mm macro lens. I would own a 105mm lens, or something in that range, 90, 105, 135, regardless. But I bought a macro lens for convenience. This goes down to half-life size all by itself. That is, you can focus this down to a subject area 2 by 3 inches just by racking the focusing mount out. This is an older version. It's not current technology at all. This is 105mm f4. One thing you'll notice, in fact, about the lenses I own, I don't actually own that many current lenses. I see no reason, though, to replace my old lenses with currently produced lenses of the same focal length and speed. After all, I've already paid for these, and they're working, and they're in good shape, so why replace them with the exact same thing once again? It's just more expense. This is one of my bread and butter lenses, the 105mm focal length. I really like this, and it gives you a very pleasing perspective on things. It's roughly the same perspective, roughly the same focal length as the human eye. It's not the same coverage, but it's the same focal length. So it gives us a very pleasing perspective. It also has, built in, a very nice, deep, long lens shade. I use lens shades religiously on all of my lenses. What's the next step up from 105? For me, it's a 200mm lens. I happen to have a 200mm macro lens. Again, I use my macro lenses as all-purpose lenses. I own macro lenses simply for the convenience of their close focusing, not particularly just for close-ups. I shoot scenes with my macro lenses. I shoot close-ups. I use this lens as a standard 200mm lens. I particularly like a couple of features about this particular lens. It has a rotating tripod collar, this big collar on the back of the lens, so I can mount the lens on the tripod. Indeed, I've got a quick-release plate on the bottom of this lens, which fits my tripod head. I mount the lens on my tripod, and then if I want to rotate vertical horizontal, I don't have to flop the tripod head over. I simply loosen the knob on the side of the lens and rotate the whole camera on the back of the system. It's a lot easier to do, to fine-tune compositions, than flopping a head over. It also has a built-in lens shade on it. I really use lens shades all the time. Every lens I carry, every lens I use, always has a lens shade on it of some sort. You'll notice also that I always keep both front and rear caps on all my lenses. I try to protect the glass as much as I possibly can. After all, it's the glass that produces the quality photograph in the end. Well, what's the next jump up from 200 millimeter? For me, it's 300 millimeter. And you can see as we get into longer and longer lenses that they physically get bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. They're more awkward to carry. They take up more space in your camera bag. No way around it. Longer focal lengths are big and heavy. This is a 300 millimeter f4. It's probably the most current lens that I own in that it's an autofocus version of this lens. I don't use it in autofocus. I still use it as a manual focus lens, but I bought it because Nikon replaced the manual focus version of this lens with the autofocus version, and they made it half a stop faster. This lens also has a built-in lens shade and a rotating tripod collar, which I really enjoy. Again, I've got a quick release plate just permanently attached to the bottom of the tripod collar. This particular lens has one odd feature on it, and that is the filters for it go back here in the back. These are 39 millimeter drop-in filters. They screw into this little filter holder, then you drop the filter holder back down into the lens. It makes it a little easier to carry filters, although once again you're carrying a different filter size, but they're a lot smaller and less costly than buying filters for the front. The front end of this lens is 82 millimeter. The only problem is trying to find a polarizer that will go in the back, and that's definitely a problem. However, I do like this lens a lot. You might notice that most of my lenses are not very fast. Most of my lenses are about f4 or slower. What's the next jump longer than a 300 millimeter lens? Well, let me put the lens cover back on this one and set it over here. My big lens, my long lens, is this one. This is a 500 millimeter f4 lens, and you can see the problem with long focal lengths. If I'm shooting wildlife, and I'm starting to shoot wildlife, let's say with my 300 millimeter lens, definitely shooting wildlife, birds and mammals with a 500 millimeter lens, you can see that if you're carrying this lens, you're probably not going to carry everything else. This is a heavy, awkward to use lens, but it lets me do things I can't do otherwise. 500 millimeter compared to a normal 50 is a 10 power optic, but that also means you have to be 10 times as careful, 10 times as aware of vibration, dust in the air, things like that. You have to be 10 times more immaculate a technician to get the same quality out of your photographs as you would with a 50 millimeter lens. This lens, a lot of it is actually a lens hood. The whole front end, this section, is simply a lens hood. It's a great lens hood. It's about the size of lens hood you need for this lens. Without the lens, the lens hood, the glass is out, unprotected. You'll get flare. If I'm going to pay the money that this lens costs, I want to do everything I possibly can to get the best quality image. That's another reason I don't put skylight filters on the front of my lenses. I've always thought it not the smartest thing to do. After all, you pay $500 for a lens, why put a $5 piece of glass in front of it? So I do use lens hoods, and I don't use skylight filters. This is a very big, specialized lens, and I think you ought to think long and hard before you ever bought a lens like this. This lens also has the 39 millimeter drop-in filters in the back, and it also has the rotating tripod collar. I wouldn't buy any lens 300 millimeter or longer without a tripod mount on the lens. In fact, ideally, I'd like to see all lenses from even 105 or longer have a tripod mount on the lens so that you can rotate vertical horizontal without flopping the tripod head over. A good tripod mount is well worth it. Well, let me move this out of the way. And so far I haven't talked about zoom lenses at all. I do use zooms, and here's my favorite zoom. This is a long discontinued 50 to 135 millimeter Nikon zoom. It was not a very popular focal length, but I love it. In fact, when Nikon discontinued it, I actually went out and searched and found a second one and just stashed it away for the future, since these are not made anymore. I like this zoom for a couple reasons. For scenic photography, it falls in the range of focal lengths that I like. between 50 and 135. I had a standard 80 to 200 millimeter zoom for a long time, and I was always at the 80 millimeter lens trying to zoom backwards shorter, and so I was running into difficulty. This zoom fits my vision of the world. You might notice once again I've got a lens hood on it, and I actually found a lens cap that just fits the end of the lens hood. It's a very easy way to keep caps on lenses. One particular thing I like about this zoom, which is unusual, it does something that most zooms don't, is that when you focus it, the front end does not rotate. Almost all zooms, when you focus, the front end rotates around, which means if you're using a polarizer, as you focus, the polarizer changes position. This zoom doesn't. I really like that feature. Plus, it was a remarkably sharp, at all apertures, zoom lens. I own a couple zooms, but I rarely use them except for this one. This zoom I use a lot. Oh, that's a whole variety of lenses. What else do I carry and what else do I use? Here's an item which I use a lot, and this is a teleconverter. This is Nikon's 1.4 teleconverter. It increases whatever you put in front of it by 1.4 times and changes the exposure by 1 stop. Of course, a through-the-lens meter compensates for this. Where do I use this? Well, I use it a lot on my longer lenses. It's made for 300 millimeter and longer. It turns my 300 millimeter f4 into a 420 millimeter f5.6. It turns my 500 f4 into a 700 f5.6. So it's very handy for that. Another place I actually use this teleconverter is I put it on my 200 millimeter macro lens. To increase the magnification, I gain some magnification when I'm shooting tight close-ups. It's handy for that. One thing I particularly like about this teleconverter is look how tiny it is. It's only about an inch and a half thick. I can stick it in my shirt pocket, and essentially I'm carrying other lenses this way. It's very convenient, and since it only changes the exposure by 1 stop, that's not too bad. Now, you may have noticed that I'm carrying all Nikon lenses. Why don't I have several different brand lenses? For a basic reason. Yeah, I can pick up any lens. Let's say I pick up this 35 millimeter lens. The focusing ring turns the same way. The f-stops always turn the same way. There's consistency from lens to lens to lens. I really like this. It simplifies your photography. There certainly are good off-brand manufacturers, and I would consider non-manufacturer lenses if I wanted to save a little money. However, my real recommendation is if you're going to skimp anywhere in the camera equipment, skimp on the camera body. After all, it's the lens quality that determines the quality of the photograph. So if I were on a real tight budget, I'd buy a less expensive camera body rather than buying a less expensive lens. What else is in this bag? Here's another item which I find really useful. This is a set of extension tubes. Extension tubes are simply spacers. There's no glass, no optics. These are simply spacers. And I've got a medium-sized one, a small one, and a big one. They're just all stacked together here. When do you need extension tubes? Well, you can take an extension tube and put it on any lens to make that lens focus closer. All lenses focus closer as you move them away from the camera body. I think you'll probably end up owning a couple extension tubes. If I had to pick one, I'd pick something like this. It's about an inch. It's sort of an all-around extension tube. But it's real handy to have an extension tube. I'll put one on my long lens, for example, to make it focus a little closer. My 500 focuses down to about 12 feet. Put an extension tube on and I can get down to about 9 feet from the subject. So that's handy. But you can see there's a lot of equipment here, all sorts of things. What else do I have? I do carry filters. And you'll notice one way I carry filters is screw them all together and put these stacking caps on the front and the back. Actually, the front one is just a regular lens cap that I've put on the front. But this lets me stack filters together and get rid of those little plastic cases they come in. That's a lot more compact. I carry 2 or 3 filters in every size filter that I need for my lenses. I carry warming filters, the 81 series, generally an 81A and an 81B, plus a polarizer for all the lenses that I have. This is a stack of 62 millimeter filters. I have the same sort of stack in 52, which a lot of my lenses also take. Another filter which I carry is a split neutral density filter. This one's made by Koken, and some other brands make them also. This is simply a filter that's half clear and half neutral density. Let me open this box, and you can see half of the filter is clear, bottom half's clear, and the top is darker. It's a neutral density. Koken actually calls them graduated gray, and you need to be a little careful about Koken filters. They scratch very easily, and some of the gray, the graduated gray filters, are not really neutral in tone. They'll have a magenta cast into them. So you need to actually shoot some film through them to make sure you get one that isn't affecting the color of your photographs. I use this when I need to tone down the contrast range of the picture. That is, half the frame needs to be dropped down so the film can see both the highlights and the shadows. Now, Koken does make a filter holder which you put on your lens, but I don't actually carry it. I simply hold this in front of my lens, use my stop down button to make sure that my fingers are out of the frame, things like that, and you can hold it in any orientation you want so that the graduation, where it changes from dark to light, falls where you want it to. It's easy enough to do. Let me put this back in the box here. I don't carry many filters. I don't really like star filters or special effect filters, anything like that. I think nature is superb enough without adding all this tinsel. One other item which I religiously carry, and in fact I always carry a couple of them, is a cable release. I always carry two just in case I either lose one or I break one. And although the new cameras take electronic cable releases, I still like these old mechanical cable releases. They're relatively inexpensive. They last forever. One problem of the electronical cable releases is that they're very delicate. It's easy to take them and break them since it's just an electrical wire. These are very rugged, and you'll have them forever. I shoot every picture I can using a cable release. Well, I hope that discussion of equipment gives you some ideas. I'd urge you not to go out and duplicate my equipment. Pick the equipment for the way you work. This happens to be some of the equipment I own, and it's the way I happen to work. But don't go out and buy the exact same thing. Different people have different visions, consequently you'll have different equipment. We've been photographing some pretty special locations, Yellowstone and Florida, but all along I've been saying you don't have to go to such remote corners of the earth to take good photographs. You can take good photographs in your own backyard, and that's literally where we are right now. We're in my backyard, standing on the deck behind my house. I'd like to illustrate some points about flower photography using this flower box here on the rail of my deck. There are some things to really consider when you're shooting flower blossoms, especially doing portraits of flowers. If you use a 50mm lens like I have here, you'll notice several things. The two things that you need to be concerned about more than anything else are working distance, how far away from the subject you are, and background coverage. If I'm working here with a 50mm lens, I'm about 18 inches from these petunias, but because of the angle of view, the wide angle of this lens, I pick up all sorts of things in the background. In fact, from where I'm standing right here, I'll be picking up, the swing set in my neighbor's backyard, the fence way back behind the back of our property here, part of the flower bed way out in the background here. And it's all because of this short focal length. The 50mm lens sees such a wide angle of view. The other thing that's apparent, of course, is working distance. How far away from the subject you are. Working distance, the space between the lens and the subject, is roughly proportional to focal length. I'm pretty close with this 50mm lens. Here, though, I'm working on a nice flat deck. The flowers are up off the ground. It's pretty easy to use a 50mm lens. I've got some room even to put my tripod, to get my tripod into position. When you're out in the field away from a situation like this, it's not quite so easy. But even with here, I'm a little cramped. I've had to kind of push my tripod right up against this deck rail in order to get this photograph. We are a little close. The drawback here, though, is background coverage. Sure enough, when I look through the lens, I see that swing set, I see the fence. I've got some real problems. Let's change lenses and back off a little bit. If I go from a 50 to twice the focal length, roughly 100 millimeter lens, I'll be twice as far away, but I've narrowed down the background coverage. Let me change lenses here. I'll take this 50 off, and I'll put on 105. As we double the focal length, to get the same image size, we're going to have to move twice as far away. It gives us more working distance, more free space. In the field, it's very helpful. Working distance is often a primary concern because you've got some room to get a tripod in. You're not bumping the subject with the tripod legs. Let's move back, though, and look at what happens to background coverage. We'll narrow down the angle of what the lens sees simply by moving away. Let me pick up the tripod, move away here. About twice as far away, we'll get the same image. Now, take a look through this lens, and you'll notice that we've eliminated the swing set just by going to a longer lens here. We're narrowing down the background coverage all the time. We've eliminated the swing set. We still have some problems, though, because we're picking up the wooden fence way in the background. But we're starting to solve our problems just by moving away. A lot more working distance, a lot less background coverage. One of the joys of using a longer focal length is this combination of more working distance, less distracting elements in the background. Consequently, when I'm shooting tight flower portraits, I'm almost never using a short lens. I either use my 105 or I even go to longer focal lengths. I use a 200 a lot. Occasionally I'll use a 300 millimeter plus extension tubes or something to make it focus closer. The problem then, though, is you're getting so far away you really can't see if the flower is moving unless you're watching through the lens all the time. And usually there's environmental problems, a bush is in the road, there's other grasses, something like that. But here we are at 105. Let me change lenses once again. Let me put a 200 on and back off twice as far away again, and once more we'll narrow down the background. Let me change lenses here. I'm going to have to take the camera off the tripod. And I'll put this 200 millimeter lens on. This tripod collar built in on the lens, which is really convenient for shooting flower blossoms. And let me pick up the tripod and move back about twice as far again. Once more, we'll compose on the same flowers. And oh yeah, now things are starting to work. Because I've got such a long lens, the swing set is still eliminated as it was with 105, but now I've narrowed down the background, and by picking and choosing where I put the tripod, by just a few inches movement of the tripod one way or another, I can totally control what I see in the background. I can eliminate the fence, I can isolate the flower blossom with this narrow angle of view just against the green grass or against the green trees or whatever I want in the background. The long lens gives me background control. The narrow angle of view lets me isolate the subject against whatever background I want behind the subject. Just by changing location a little tiny bit, I can totally influence what the lens sees behind the subject. And I think backgrounds are the important side of close-up photography, of flower photography, that we tend to forget about. We concentrate so much on the subject, the flower blossom itself, we forget that it's just as important what's behind the subject. Long lenses, something like a 200 millimeter to shoot flower blossoms, gives you that control. I probably shoot most of my tight flower portraits with a 200 millimeter lens. Let's review the setups we did with different lenses. Here's a 50 millimeter shot. Now we're going to try to keep the image size roughly the same as we move the tripod and the camera further away from the subject. Watch what happens to the background. The image may change a little bit because we're not perfectly precise, but watch the backgrounds. They'll illustrate our point. 50 millimeter shot. Let's go back to 100 millimeters. See what's happening to the background? You're narrowing down all the time, eliminating distracting elements. Now let's go from 105 back to 200 millimeters. Again, you're narrowing down the background, solving problems by backing off with a long lens. When I'm shooting individual flower blossoms, one thing I do is try to control the light. I don't like to use flash on flowers. The problem is the lighting is always the same. I've seen a lot of photographs where people have used flash, a multiple flash setup on a flower. And in my mind, it always looks like you shot all your flower pictures the same night down in your basement. Part of the ambiance of any given location is the light itself. The light in Michigan is not the same as the light in Utah, and the light in Utah is not the same as the light in Oregon, and Oregon is not the same as Florida, and it's the light that makes the difference. The light in the morning is not the same as the light at noon, and so on and so forth. So I try to avoid flash on flowers whenever I possibly can. Instead, I want to shoot in natural light. Obviously, though, you have to control the light. On a blazing sun day, when it's brilliant sunshine, what I do a lot of times is shade the entire plant with an umbrella or a diffuser, a big piece of white nylon, for example. Or sometimes I just take a regular rain umbrella, open it, and throw a shadow over the entire plant. Watch out for hot spots in the background. On individual blossoms, something I do a lot is just use reflectors. Reflectors are nice because they will never overpower the main light. Plus, you can see the results. One problem with fill flash is you never see the results until you get the film back. With a reflector, you can see the effect right away. Now, what is a reflector? Well, the ones I use are just pieces of cardboard covered with crumpled up aluminum foil. Here's a standard gray card. It's a gray card on one side and aluminum foil crinkled and then spread out and covered up on the other side. Very, very easy to make. I used a gray card just because it's good solid cardboard. Here's another little reflector. It actually has Christmas wrapping paper dry mounted to it, sort of a silver side and a gold side. The gold throws a little bit warmer effect onto the plant if you want a warm effect. It's sort of like adding an 81A filter in case you need it real fast. Let's use these reflectors on this little petunia blossom here and just look at what you can do with something as basic as two little tiny reflectors. Watch this. I could shade the plant and throw light in from the other side. Or I could just use the reflector all by itself. And I can see what happens to the flower just by doing this. I could use two reflectors, bouncing light two different directions. Or I could add a little warmth. The gold side, it definitely throws a warmer light. Watch what happens when I alternate between the silver and gold sides of this reflector. We can really change the warmth, the temperature of the light. The gold side definitely throws a gold cast on it, while the silver side is a cooler light that's thrown across the blossom. And again, what I really like about reflectors is that you can see the results. You watch through the lens, you can see what happens, you can see exactly where you want to position the reflectors, you can control the situation totally. It's very easy to do this. It's nice having the tripod, of course, or the camera on a tripod because it frees up your hands to hold the reflectors. If you're working very, very close to the ground, a lot of times I'll just shove a little stick in the ground and lean a reflector up against the stick. This is not really complex, a complex situation. Very simple lighting control. One of the problems with shooting really tight close-ups of flower blossoms is positioning the camera in the exact spot that you want it to be. A hint that I would give you is start off not mounting the camera right on your tripod. Handhold the camera initially, move around until you figure out the rough position you want to be, then go get your tripod and set it up. If you start off with the camera mounted on the tripod, you'll end up shooting from whatever position you initially set it just because you put it there. You have to justify setting up the tripod. So handhold, then get the tripod, and you'll work in the position that way. It's very difficult, though, to move a tripod an inch or two either way. And for extreme close-ups, the position of the camera is absolutely critical. There's a temptation to focus by changing the focusing mount on the lens, but what you're actually doing is changing the extension in the lens. Focusing a camera is really moving it closer or further away from the subject. So for extreme close-ups, a piece of equipment I would recommend is to add a focusing rail or rack and pinion. All this is a geared rail that goes between the camera and the tripod head. Instead of moving the tripod, you can actually move the camera back and forth across the tripod head. Remember, this is focusing where turning the focusing mount on the lens is actually changing the extension. This simplifies fine-tuning your composition and fine-tuning your focus a lot. A hint that I'd give you here is start off with the rack and pinion sort of in the middle of the rail, so you've got movement on both sides. If you start off at one end or the other, you're going to be stuck. It's a great aid for tight close-ups of flowers. One really esoteric piece of equipment which I use for landscape photography is this old Nikon PB4 bellows. A bellows is simply a variable extension tube, and in order to reach infinity focus you need a special lens for the bellows. It's called a short mount lens. It has no focusing mount all of its own. And this is a 105mm short mount lens on this Nikon bellows. The reason I'm mentioning this is it lets you do something that there's no other way to do in 35mm photography, and that's to use some view camera technique. The front standard of this bellows moves side to side, and if you flop it over so the bellows is sideways, you now have a tilting lens board. What this lets you do is photograph a couple types of scenes that you simply can't do any other way. That is, you can have overall depth of field, sharpness from foreground to background, overall focus all at once with the lens fairly wide open. Or if you're shooting a intimate landscape, a field of flowers, something like that, and you want to put the lens real close to the subject, you can maximize where your plane of focus falls. There's a view camera technique that talks about changing where the plane of focus is. With a regular 35mm camera and a normal lens for a 35mm system, the plane of focus is always parallel to the back of the camera. That is, the film plane and focus plane are always parallel. But you're not always shooting subjects that are parallel to the back of the camera. Imagine that you're shooting a field of flowers. We have the film plane, the back of the camera, and then we have the plane of the subject. Well, if you tilt the lens down, if you tilt so that the plane of the film, the plane of the subject, and the plane of the lens, all three meet in a common point, then you've changed where the plane of focus falls. Now you're focused on this flat plane in front of you, and you can actually tilt the lens, and it doesn't take very much. You tilt the lens and you can see the plane of focus change right in your viewfinder. Now this is a 105mm lens on this bellows. It's a little awkward. It's certainly bulky to carry. The problem is that's the shortest lens I can put on this bellows and still hit infinity focus. There are a very few other lenses made for 35mm photography that also have tilts on them. I have another one here. This is a Canon lens, a Canon 35mm f2.8 that tilts. It tilts and then it rotates on the camera mount. And I actually bought this lens and had a repairman put a Nikon mount on the very back of it so I can put it onto my Nikons. Again, it doesn't take much of a tilt in order to use this. Canon's also just announced 3 tilt lenses for their EOS system of cameras, a 24, 45, and 90mm lens. These are very specialized lenses. There's not a lot of times that you really need tilts, but it lets you do something in 35mm photography that no one else can do. This crested dwarf iris from the Smokies could have been shot with any lens, even a 50 if I could have gotten it close enough. I used my 105mm lens for convenience sake. You might notice the overall depth of field. Basically I'm photographing a flat plane, and by paralleling the camera back to the plane of the leaves and the iris, I was able to get overall depth of field at a moderate f-stop. This California poppy, though, shows a very limited depth of field. You don't always have to have everything in the frame sharp. Here I'm shooting almost wide open for an abstract wash of color. Notice also this is shot at an oblique angle, in contrast to my normal way of working where everything's sharp and in focus. These violets, photographed also in the Smoky Mountains National Park, are carefully positioned in the frame. Notice their placement. They radiate from a lower right thirds placement. We'll talk about this more in the tape on composition. These red currents, photographed in Oregon, were very difficult to shoot as there was one bright highlight in the background on the very edge of the frame. I had to minutely reposition my tripod and kept checking the frame until I could eliminate them. Finally, the only solution was substitute my 200mm lens for my 105. Then, by carefully repositioning once again, I was able to solve the problem. This fire pink is an example of how warm colors advance and cool colors seem to recede, hence giving three-dimensionality to what is really a two-dimensional plane. This is shot fairly wide open in order to float the red on top of the green ferns in the background. I carefully picked this trio of flowering dogwood blossoms after searching almost the whole tree for an ideal branch. Notice the isolation of these subjects and how simple this composition is. The background is simply dropped out by using a long lens. You don't always have to shoot just blossoms. These are red maple seeds or keys. Here the problem was wind. These long-stemmed seeds tremble in the slightest breeze, and I had to wait and wait and wait.
Taking a break here, get a little coffee. It's going to feel good on a day like today. 4 days ago when we came up here to start taping, it was 80 degrees. Today it's right around freezing. I've got on about all the clothes I have with me. Definitely cold and damp. Environmental concerns are a real factor in outdoor photography. You have to be prepared for the weather, because weather affects not only how you perform, but how your cameras and your film perform. Heat's one thing we don't have to worry about today, but a lot of times you do have to be concerned about it. Heat affects film and cameras. Film is definitely temperature critical. I protect my film traveling. I actually carry it in a cooler. I even do this even though times like this when we don't have to worry about the heat. But this little cooler is just where I stash film. And traveling, it's a good way to go. It's easy to carry, and you've got all your film together. And it does protect it from the temperature. I wouldn't leave film in a locked car if I could avoid it. And I definitely wouldn't leave it in a place like the glove box, or sometimes on the back floor, this floor of the back seat. You're right above the catalytic converter. You have to be careful of that, and especially in the newer cars. Be very aware of where it's located. Black cameras are heat sinks. You leave them out totally in the sun in midday if you're working in the desert, someplace like that. Black cameras will definitely take a lot of heat. Get a little heat from this coffee right now. You have to worry about cold in a number of ways. Batteries in cameras are very cold sensitive. If you get down too far below freezing, batteries will slow down, just like the battery in your car. One nice thing about some of the newer cameras, this Nikon F4 for example, is they take AA batteries. And there are 6 AA's or 8 AA's are a lot more useful in cold weather than the little button cells that older cameras used to run off of. A few tips for winter photography is, 1, don't try to blow dust off your lenses. If you use your own breath, of course, it'll condense on the lens. You might end up with ice rather than dust on your lens. You may notice this tripod, I've taped the legs. There's quite a temperature difference between the taped area and the bare metal. The bare metal is so much colder that just doing this, taping it, in this case it's just standard electrician's tape, really helps protect your hands. It's far easier to work, far easier to hold the tripod, just something that basic on it. Something else you can do for cold weather photography to protect your cameras when you're going from outside back inside is try to keep condensation from forming all over the camera. And sometimes the condensation will form inside the camera when you take it from a cold to hot environment, and you'll get condensation on your film. An easy solution for that is just take a plastic bag,
let me pull the camera off the tripod here. If this were totally cold, let's say it's down around 0 degrees or so, before you bring this camera back indoors, just take a plastic bag, put this inside the plastic bag and squeeze all the air out of it. Now when you bring it indoors, condensation will form on the outside of the bag rather than the outside of the camera. Let me put this back on the tripod here. Oh, get a little more coffee too. A lot of the newer cameras are protected from the rain much better than they were in years past. In fact, even though they're electronic, they'll take some moisture. I try not to work in the real pouring rain. If there's a little mist or a little drizzle, I just ignore it totally. I wipe the camera off with a towel or handkerchief every once in a while and just keep going. But if it seriously starts to rain, or if you want to explore an area in the rain or protect your camera while you look around, handy tip that I've used a lot is carry a shower cap. I've got just a standard old-fashioned shower cap, and if you have your camera on the tripod like this, here's a shower cap with elastic in it. You can just cover your camera. The elastic keeps the shower cap there, keeps it from blowing off in the wind. You can walk around this way, carry it around use your neck strap in fact with a shower cap over the camera, whatever you want to do. This is the best thing I know of. It looks a little weird, but it works great in the field. Let me take this shower cap back off. We don't have to worry about it today, but if you're working someplace with some blowing sand, along a beach for example, you also need to protect the camera there. I'd just be very careful. It's one place I would use a protective filter on my lens. Blowing sand, blowing salt spray. There's one. If you're working along the beach on the oceans, there's a lot of salt spray in the air. I'd put a UV filter on. People have asked me about UV filters in the past, and I've said not to use them unless you have a very specific reason. Well, there, if you're working on a beach, you have a reason. You can say, I am protecting my camera from blowing salt spray or blowing sand. I'd add a UV filter in that case, or at least always leave the lens cap on except when you're actually shooting. At the minimum, I'd do that. I'd also be really careful about reloading film when you're working along blowing sand, blowing salt spray conditions. It's amazing how much can get inside the camera while you're just fumbling around with a roll of film. One thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about cold weather photography is winterizing cameras. You just don't need to do it anymore. Modern cameras with modern lubricants take the cold just fine. Older cameras, 20 years ago, yes, people had to winterize them, remove all the lubricants, but don't even worry about it today. I use motor drives, motor rewinds all the time in winter, and I've never had any trouble with film breakage or static marks. Now I'm using color slide film, and I think if you're using black and white film, I'd be a little more careful. But all in all, if you can take the weather, so can your cameras. I'm here in Yellowstone National Park with Dave Middleton. David and I have been photographing a variety of winter subjects, scenics, mammals, just winter in general, a cross-section of everything that we're finding here. We'd like to talk a minute about the films that we're using and films that you could be using. There are two types of film, negative film and slide film or transparency film. The type of film you shoot depends on what you want to do with your photographs. Negative film, both color and black and white, give you a negative from which you make a print. And if you want prints as the final result, I'd certainly suggest that you shoot negative film. On the other hand, slides let you project the image. Transparencies or slide film, it's all the same thing. If you're thinking of publishing your photographs at all, you'll want to shoot slides because that's what editors work from. However, there is no such thing as one correct film. I would urge you to tailor your film as to what you want to do with the final result. And here's a hint. Don't use the films that I use necessarily. I pick my films for very specific reasons, and I wouldn't just assume that because someone is shooting a film that you should shoot that film. Do some testing and find the film that you like. What films are you using, David?
Well, in Yellowstone here in winter, Fujifilm is a nice film. Fuji makes 3 kinds of films: Velvia, Fuji 50, and Fuji 100.
Are these negatives or slides?
These are slide films. I'm, as John, a professional photographer, and I use a lot of my films and send it to editors in the print medium. So I'm using Velvia a lot now. Velvia is a brand new Fuji film. It's very fine grain. It has high color saturation. And in these hot springs here in Yellowstone, the subtle colors of the peaches and the greens and the yellows, I think Velvia really does a nice job on it.
I really agree with you there. I like the film because it's able to record those subtle pastels and a lot of variation in the film. It's also very sharp, and sharpness and graininess is something that both you and I are concerned about because we're selling photographs for the printed page, the end result. There's certainly nothing wrong with graininess in a film. It adds to mood and atmosphere. But in general, a lot of the subjects that both you and I photograph, we're trying to get the sharpest, least grain in the final subject.
And which brings us to the other common film that's used is the Kodachrome films, 25, 64, and 200. 25 and 64 we used to use a lot, and for winter it works really well. It has real nice clean whites, and they're nice and sharp and fine grain.
That's true. In fact, I've switched from the Kodachromes pretty much to Fujichrome films. I'm shooting the Velvia ISO 50 film and Fujichrome 100. 100 is my sort of action film where I need an extra stop of speed to stop moving birds, moving animals, things like that. But Velvia is quickly becoming my standard non-moving subject film. It's sort of my view camera film. However, I'm still using a little bit of Kodachrome, and surprisingly, one of the Kodachromes I'm using is Kodachrome 200, and I'm using it in winter in snowstorms where the graininess accentuates the blowing snow. It is a clean film. It's a little warm, but it is fairly clean in the colors.
Yesterday was a good example when we were up doing the buffalo. And it was a snowy scene. Snow was blowing, and we needed a little extra speed to stop the buffalo.
That's right. We were in a situation where too slow of a film simply would not have worked. I think one thing that's very apparent from this discussion is there is no one film. We don't standardize on one film, we standardize on several films. And something else that's very apparent, and I know both of you and I have done this, is we change. We test new films as they come out. What I was shooting 2 years ago is not what I'm shooting now, and I know that 2 years from now we'll both probably be shooting another film that's on the market. You don't want to get stuck using the same thing all the time just because you used to use it.
The other difference between Fujifilm and Kodachromes are that Fuji's can be processed very quickly. Almost any lab can do it. In Kodachromes, you have to send it to a specialized lab who has a special machine that only can process Kodachromes.
I'd like to stress once more that the films I use really change. In the first book that I wrote, I talked about using the Kodachromes, and a lot of people have come to me now and have sort of been surprised that I'm not using Kodachromes. Well, things change, and films change, and my preferences change. Because I'm shooting Fuji now doesn't necessarily mean that I'll be shooting Fuji the rest of my life. Who knows? I think I should really stress that you should test films, evaluate them, and pick the one that you like.
One final point that we hear a lot in our workshops is that Fuji films do not accurately render the scene. It's not reality. And as photographers, we really don't deal in reality. We play with depths of fields, we put filters in front of our cameras. It's not reality, it's what really the final result, if we like it or not.
That's right. If I wanted reality, I wouldn't photograph, I would look at the scene itself,
right,
where I'm picking a film because I like it.
Right.
And that I think is the most important thing. Do you like the film? Do you like the colors in it? Do you like the grain in it, the sharpness? If you like it, by definition, it's good.
That's right.
Well, let's say we get back to photographing. This is a nice spring, and let's take some shots.
you.